Thank you, Mike. Thank you all for coming. I'm just looking around. This is a great turnout for a Wednesday night. Thank you. Thank you all. This is my third visit, I believe, to the Milford Public Library. The first was 20 years ago, I believe, shortly after the publication of my first book, A Gentle Madness, which Mike mentioned, and I think I was here 5 or 6 years ago. 5 years ago. So we've kind of covered it. I mean, in terms of the progression of my work. This one is very interesting because since all of my earlier books have been really about books, this is about paper. And you say, well, good, what in the world happened there? You know, and I think after you've written about bibliomania and bibliophilia and biblio this and biblio that, and people who steal books and people who love them and people who have been killed by them, people who kill for them, all of these things, ultimately you want to deal with the subject of the actual construction of a book itself. And one of my books, A Splendor of Letters, I had a chapter in there on writing surfaces through history. You know, when we think of a book, we think of the codex, the standard kind of a book on paper between hardcovers, but books have taken multiple forms over the centuries. I mean, writing is 5,000 years old. We've had books on clay tablets, on papyrus strips, on silk, on bamboo, anything that's been available and inexpensive and easy to use has been used as a writing surface. Here in the West and in Asia for 2,000 years since the invention of paper, and we'll discuss the actual invention of it, and less time, maybe 1,000 years, 1,200 years in Europe and America, it's been paper. So it just seemed like the natural thing as the next step in my process to really write about this medium we call paper. But I have to say, it took me 8 or 9 years, and once I got into this subject, it absolutely took on a life of its own. It was not just about books. There's an association of paper historians, and it's the British Association of Paper Historians, and they estimate that there are 20,000 today, 20,000 identifiable commercial uses for paper. Trust me, I'm not going to give you all 20,000 here tonight. But once I got into this thing, we talk about the paperless society. You know, there's a wonderful quote. There's a gentleman here we are in a library, so it's a very pertinent quote. A man by the name of Jesse Scherer. He was a librarian, history of libraries, and he said, the paperless library is about as probable as the paperless bathroom. And I use that as an epigraph in one of the chapters. So that is background. You're looking at the two jackets for on paper. On the left is the hardcover. Wonderful. When my editor at Knopf, Vicki Wilson, we were talking about how in the world do you, because it is 18 chapters of cultural history. So, I mean, if you're really looking for a how-to book on making paper, I get into that a little bit, but I'm far more interested in the cultural consequences of paper. And we'll be getting into quite a bit of that in the presentation. But what do you get for an image for a book on paper? So why not try and replicate or try and suggest a sheet of handmade paper? And that's what they did right there. I have a copy of the hardcover here if anyone wants to look at it afterwards. And that little silver medal up there on the top, that's not me that put that there. That's the American Library Association. So that was the silver medal, the Carnegie second place. Nothing I'd like to have first. What are you going to do? Doris Goodwin took first. Wonderful book. But this was second, so there you go. And that's the paperback right there. And that's the Spanish edition right there. Came out a couple of years ago. The Korean edition on the right. Connie and my wife and I went to Korea 2 years ago. I gave the keynote address at an international conference on paper, and it just happened to be when the Korean edition was coming out. Now, if we were to give this lecture in about 2 or 3 months, I'd have the Japanese book and the Chinese book, which are coming out early next year up there. But it's I love the way every one of them did a little something different off the same theme. So when we talk about paper, I have to say, I really wanted to get into who invented it. One of the most amazing things about paper is that the Chinese regard it, because it was invented in China, as one of the 4 great inventions of antiquity, paper being one, printing as we know it. We like to think here in the West that Gutenberg invented the printing press in the 15th century. Well, the Chinese beat him by a good 400 or 500 years. And of course, it wasn't metal type, but they invented printing with blocks. The magnetic compass and gunpowder, those are what they claim to be their 4 great inventions. And they're pretty consequential, you have to admit. So what you're looking at here, this is a pretty amazing, if I didn't have that title up there, and I would ask, and I have to say, I've asked the question at least 40 or 50 times, can anyone tell me what they're looking at? Well, now you know. It's the Diamond Sutra from 868 AD. And what you're looking at are two of those Chinese inventions in one example. You're looking at the oldest known dated book. Their year is not 868, but it corresponds, and it is dated in a dating system of whatever they were using. And that's a Buddhist sutra that was found in the Caves of the Thousand Buddhas by Sir Aurel Stein about 110 years ago. And it is now in the British Library. It's unique. But so you're looking at paper and printing in one example. And when I talk about why I got into this, it's kind of to trace this development. So if you're going to really write about the history of paper, you have to go to China. And thankfully, I had an NEH research grant for this book, as I have now for the one on Longfellow. And it allowed me to go to China, where paper, one of the most amazing things. Now, those other inventions that I showed you, we cannot say with any certainty when the Chinese invented them. We can say with a good degree of certainty, we know when paper was invented, we know where, we know even by whom. What really inspired them to come up with the process for paper making, and we'll talk about it, we don't know, but it was nothing that was inevitable. That's another wonderful thing about paper. It really is a wonderful idea. It's not something that just exists naturally. So I put this, most of the pictures in this presentation are mine. I put this here because it's really quite beautiful. It's the Salween River out there along the old Burma Road in western China from World War II days, and this is kind of nice. And there's the old Burma Road down below. If you know your World War II history, those are the foothills of the Himalayas. We bring supplies in World War II into China along the Burma Road, and they were flying in over the hump, as they used to say. That's the new China Road. That's 3,000 miles from Beijing to Mumbai. And when I was out there with a group of, believe it or not, paper historians, I was the only civilian among them, actually. I was invited to tag along for 3 weeks. And as we went to a whole succession of villages, the hope being to find examples of where paper is still made today, 2,000 years after it was invented, and pretty much exactly the way it was when it was invented. And you'll see some of these things. This is really, these two ladies I'm traveling with, they're walking up 300 steps. It's like Shangri-La, James Hilton's Lost Horizon. And we were going up to the top of this hill because that's where this, one of the many paper mills we found was up. Why so high on a hill? Because that's where the pure water is. And I'll tell you before I forget, because it's so essential. What did the Chinese discover? They discovered that if you take any cellulose material, it can be grass, it can be leaves, it can be bananas, it can be really anything. Anything that is cellulosic, and if you pound it, beat it to a pulp, one of these cliches, beat it to a pulp, mix it in with copious amounts of clean water, and pass it through a sieve, like a screen, and what is left because of this miracle? The Chinese didn't even know what have a phrase for it, what we know now is hydrogen bonding. It's a chemical process that allows the cellulose fibers to attach, which is why paper is mostly water, and what's left is a film of paper. People think erroneously that paper emerges from papyrus. We'll get to that later. Nothing could be further from the truth. Papyrus comes from Egypt. Papyrus is not a compound. Papyrus can only be made from one material, which is the papyrus plant, which grew only really in the Nile River Valley, and it was strips. It was a laminate. Paper, on the other hand, is a compound. It's really a unique material. So these are just, I've got a lot of slides, so I'll be going through them rather quickly. And there's the process, the basic process of paper making. You know, there are the beating, preparation, washing the fiber, cooking the fiber, beating it, passing it through a sieve. Now this particular example, if you look at the fibration, I scanned that. We went to one place where they make a paper, where the Chinese make paper from a specific kind of a material that grows in the forest, and they still use it today to kill parasites in livestock. And it's called Naxi paper. It's from an indigenous people in China. They continue to make it in the same process. You can see those long fibers. And actually the ancient Chinese emperors and their successors used and continue to use this paper for their official documents because it was impervious to being to insects, really, and actually they continue to use it to kill parasites. So this is what you're looking at here are these are the branches of the paper mulberry tree. Now, it's not the mulberry tree for silkworms, but what's really amazing about the Chinese mode of paper making, original paper making, is it's really renewable. They don't cut down the whole tree. They just cut these young branches. You're looking at these branches. They're really carried on the backs of these mainly family members, and they come here with and this is actually in Korea. I went to Korea after this book, where they make paper in the same sort of way. But so you look at Hanji is the name for the Korean paper. It has different names. Washi is Japanese. In Chinese, it has a different name. But you're looking at I'm going to go pretty quickly, and then here we are. This is one of maybe 30 or 40. I mean, over 3 weeks, it's amazing the amount of mills that we found. Now, when we arrived at this one, the woman who was leading our trip, her name was Elaine Koretsky, and she had been doing this for about 40 years, and I do profile her in chapter 1 of the book. And she's been doing this forever, and she's been trying to document throughout really the Far East, but China in particular, examples of where paper is still made in the same way as it was when it was. But when we came upon this village, actually it was up one of these mountains, she's like 90 now. I mean, so this is 10 years ago. She was no kid. And when we went there, but she started shouting, "They're cooking, they're cooking, they're cooking." And all the years she'd been coming, she never really got there on a day that they were cooking fiber. And they probably do it one day a month, maybe once every other couple of months. They make a lot of this fiber, and they cook it in a big old cauldron like you see there. And then they just pour it. Doesn't that look like pasta, doesn't it? This is just, and that's the inner bark. Now they take these branches from these paper mulberry trees, and they scoop out that soft, fibrous material, kind of scoop it right out, and they cook it and then they soak it. It's totally natural, and then they pound it into a pulp. And then, by the way, I met a lot of paper makers, and this gentleman, this was at a place called Jade Spring, very close down to near the border with Burma. His ancestors had been making paper at this place. That's kind of Jade, if you have to take my word for it, but I'm told that says Jade Spring there on the left there in Chinese characters. But his family had been making paper in the same mill for 500 years. And when we got there, they were closing about a month or two later. And the reason was not for lack of business, but because no one in the family he had a son working with him, but a grandson was making good money in that highway you just saw being made a few frames back out there. Civilization is coming in and it's changing. And everywhere I went, I found really that the gentlemen who run the business is really the people who are doing the work of their wives. That's his wife right there. She's doing most of the work. And that's his son down there, and paper. So we got samples everywhere we went. I sent all my samples to Texas A&M last year. And here's, again, some of the sheet formation. And that's in the same mill at Jade Spring. And it's an amazing thing. They can do one of these every 20 seconds. And there were 2 women working here. They were doing like 3 a minute. And they fill up, there's a post. If you look just behind that woman to her left, you'll see this post of sheets of paper rising. It's called a post. And we'll just move along. And then that's a 2-man. That's an amazing, that's like a 6-foot sheet of handmade paper. And that's a very high quality sheet of paper being made in the lower right. That will be used for calligraphy, for art purposes. These on the left, they'll be used for a multitude of different purposes. Now, this kind of paper just makes up a fraction of the paper that's being made in China. Most of it, like everywhere else, is being done commercially and massive machines. But way out there, and these are the western provinces. We went out to Yunnan province and Sichuan province. We went through those 2 provinces, which is way out. It's a couple thousand miles west of Beijing. And found these people. Everybody smokes cigarettes. See these 2 guys down there? You're going to see this everywhere. And then I'll go through some of these. With Francis Bacon, when he was writing about, and when Francis Bacon was writing about these great inventions, and he cited them, nobody knew then that any of these things came from China. But paper in particular, he said, an absolutely singular substance. And boy, it really is. And they dry it, they hang it on rafts, or they brush it on brick walls, or all sorts of drying procedures. And again, we're looking at taking the breaks, people doing their paper making. And again, we bought examples everywhere we went. From Yunnan, we went up to bamboo country, Sichuan, where all the panda bears are from. Up there, they make their paper from bamboo. Now you say, part of the story of the history of paper making is that what you needed was a fiber. What you needed was a plentiful supply of fiber. People were looking for it for centuries. Finally, in the 19th century, we in the West learned how to make paper to our detriment or to our advantage, who knows, from trees. We know what's happened to the forests. So you say, gee, it took us hundreds of years to learn how to make paper in the West. How come the Chinese have been doing it for many, many hundreds of years? Well, guess what? The bamboo is not a tree, it's a grass. The problem with trees is it has this compound in there called lignin, which even though you can make paper with it, and which is why we have very, very bad paper made from wood in the 19th century, it's because of this acid. They need acids to take out this lignin. It's complicated, but it's a compound that keeps the cellulosic atoms together. But this is the great bamboo, the inland bamboo sea. It was amazing. And that's bamboo being prepared for production. Spirit paper. You know, there are 1.3 billion people in China, but there were probably 300 or 400 million of people, you know, more than the population of the United States, which still and have always practiced their Buddhist religion. Paper is a very important part of the Buddhist ritual, and we actually went to an amazing temple in Kunming, and this is it. Here, it was over 1,000 years old, and they were using this paper. You know, you burn this paper, and the smoke goes up, and it goes around corners. Don't ask me any more than that. I don't know, but it's very important in the ritual. Well, so from China, I went the next year to Japan. Now, the Japanese, as we know, paper is followed. One of the great aspects of this story is how paper really migrated. We know where it started, and we know how it traveled. We know when it got to places along the way. Every place it went, it had an impact. So it starts in China, and it moved in two directions. It moved in this direction through Korea, down to Japan, in that direction, and the other direction we'll get to presently, across Central Asia into the Arab countries, and where the Arabs become dominant, and then it goes to Europe. But in China, which got it about 200 or 300 years after the Chinese invented it, and the Chinese kept this as a proprietary skill for hundreds of years, it came to China. It is believed in this city, this is called Echizen City. It's about 3 or 4 hours northwest of Tokyo by train. And here you have and when the Japanese learned how to make paper, they became arguably the greatest paper makers in the world. Their paper is exquisite. It's used for everything. It is strong. It follows traditional principles of paper making, but they also use this Japanese grown, again, the mulberry branch. And so one of the reasons I wanted to go to Japan, not only to replicate what I'd seen in China, but because China has 5 living national treasure paper makers. And if you want to spend a day with a living national treasure paper maker, you go to Echizen City and you meet a man. I'll show you him presently. But also, this is the home of the Okamoto Otaki Shrine. They have a goddess of paper making. It's a Shinto shrine. That shrine is many hundreds of years old. It commemorates the arrival, as the tradition goes, this goddess by the name of Kawakama Gozen. She is the goddess of paper making. Paper, handmade paper, is also used in the Shinto and the Buddhist religion. You see paper at the lintels, and that's there's an effigy of that woman again in that particular shrine. It's at the base of a mountain. Those are cedar trees, and at the top of that mountain, there's an effigy of this goddess. And once every year, for 3 or 4 days, the paper makers go up and they bring her down, and that little carriage over there, it's not a carriage or whatever you call it, it's a litter, and they bring her around town and they ask her for blessings. It's pretty amazing, and that tells the story in Japanese of her story. And then this is Nagashisuki, which is the Japanese process of paper making. That's an 18th century print. Again, it's the same. Nagashisuki kind of means actually swirling. It means swirling water. And there he is, Ichibe Owano, the 9th. And I spent about 4 hours with him. He didn't speak a word of English, but I had some pretty good translators. And he is the son of the first living national treasure paper maker in Japan. So that was 2 generations. His father was the first, he's the second. He is regarded by artists who use his paper as probably the greatest living paper maker. And he takes it very philosophically. He believes in the goddess. He prays to the goddess of paper making, and he makes this wonderful paper. And then when I arrived there he is, and that's his son in the lower frame. This was a man is in his 80s, and they were both on their hands and knees. And let me tell you, one of the reasons they're there is that they have this very pure, very cold, freezing water which comes down. For the pure water, the purer the water, the better the paper. The purer the water. And also what they are doing is they are by hand removing specks from the paper to ensure purity by hand, to take all whatever specks are in that fiber that I showed you earlier being cooked, and they will make that paper. Of course, here's his wife. She makes all the paper. Remember we said that earlier? When we were there, he didn't make a single sheet. And there she is, and they knew exactly how many sheets they would get out of that particular basin. And I think they said they counted on 80. They had an order. And then he took me over to the drying room. And he's, by the way, 9 generations of paper maker. And he is Ichibei Owano the 9th. And now his son will be the 10th. And it doesn't automatically go to your son or even the firstborn son. It goes to, it could be a nephew, it could be the second born. You will only get that name Ichibei or whatever other name it is if you agree to carry on and to learn the traditions. The one who agrees to learn is the one who will carry on the tradition. In his case, it was the son. Now, what he wanted me to, and then we went into this room and he took a sheet of this paper and he said, go ahead, through the translator, tear it. And I couldn't tear it. He said, tear it. I couldn't do it. He took it, he did it himself. Just look at that one fiber. You wonder why Japanese paper. It's also used for all types of preservation and conservation. You can make it so thin it's like a membrane, and it'll still be very strong. When they're doing conservation, they're repairing books, they get this very thin Japanese tissue, and when they put it on with like a vegetable adhesive, you can't even see it, and it's a remarkable material. And then we went to other places in Japan where they're making paper. And by the way, Master Owano gave me that little piece of paper. That's his mark on the bottom. It's my notebook down below, my tape recorder up there. But it says there, the joy of living with paper. Kind of nice. But so, you say, what's the oldest, what's the first? And so the Japanese, I showed you the Diamond Sutra. Well, guess what? The Japanese actually, they did some printing 100 years earlier. And there's a famous story about the Empress Shokotu, who actually very, very few empresses in Japanese history, but she was very pleased to have beaten down a claim against her reign, and also for having survived a plague. And so she ordered 1 million of these prayers to be made, and each one was to be inserted into a little miniature pagoda, like you see their hand carved. They made 1 million of them, and they're actually older than the Gutenberg Bible and the other. And they survive. They're still about, I personally have handled 3 or 4 of them. And so that's one of them. And then I went to Korea and they said, yeah, well, guess what? We have a document that's even older. And that's the Great Dharani Sutra. And they actually have another one that's, well, actually that's it right there. The Great Dharani Sutra. So, you never say something's the oldest or the first or the best, because you never know what's out there. But, and we'll actually have a similar thing when we get to North America further on down. But about the 1800-year migration, as I said, it's 1800 years from the time it starts in China till it comes here and it comes to Australia in the 19th century. But there was a battle in 751 AD. So it's been recorded by Arabic historians, by Chinese historians. The only time the Arabs and the Chinese engaged in a war, it was a territorial war, and the Arabs won. They defeated these Chinese and they took prisoner paper makers who, in return for their lives, taught the Arabs how to make paper. And for the next 500 years, at Samarkand is where it started. This is one of the reasons there was a lot of resistance in Europe for bringing paper in. We talk about the Islamic and the Christian and the Crusades and all that. Well, paper was coming from these infidels, right? So they said. But again, look, the process is the same. Now, what the Arabs really introduced, and it's amazing, and they weren't given credit for this. The Europeans tried to claim it, but was using rags, cotton rags. When we hear of rag paper, it really is rags. Cotton is 100% cellulose. So I told you can make paper from any kind of vegetable material you can, but the best has been, always will be, still is cotton, because it's 100% cellulose. And when you have 100% linen, you've already got this material that's been beaten and processed, And so you're really looking, this is I got this image from the British Library. The only image I had to pay a lot of money for, but I had to have it because they really didn't document it so much with imagery. And so I had to have that picture, but it's quite beautiful. It's in the book. And then of course, why did this become so useful and so popular in the Islamic world is because it kind of arrives there 100 years after Muhammad arrives, the Prophet Muhammad, and part of their faith is repeating their prayers and spreading their faith through papermaking and also beauty. Calligraphy becomes the most revered art in the Islamic world. You're really looking at paper here and beautiful calligraphy, various dates. These are from various museums, the Metropolitan Museum, the Smithsonian, wonderful examples. Here's an example of Quranic calligraphy from Persia in the 14th century, magnificent with gold. And really, one of the reasons, by the way, given, and I discuss it in the book, they had paper making before Europe. Why did all of a sudden, after some of these empires, did that part of the world kind of regress and Europe went forward? They resisted printing. They outlawed printing. Up until the 19th century, it was illegal to print in most countries of the Islamic world because calligraphy had to be done by hand and it was beautiful. Anyway, that's a whole other discourse. But you talk about unintended consequences, that's one. So that's a Quran made in North Africa in the 11th century. I picked that's in the British Library because it's about the 11th century that paper now moves into Spain, which was controlled by the Moors for many, many years. So the first paper making facility in Europe is in Spain, and it moves very quickly from Spain to Italy to Germany. And now there's a wonderful book called by a man named Dard Hunter, the History of Papermaking. It's magnificent. Knopf, same publisher as me. It was published in the 1940s. If you really want to know all about the history, you go to that book. I'm very grateful to the late Dard Hunter because it kind of liberated me that I could really do this in a way that I could do it culturally and really hit the high spots and look at it through illustration. But you're looking at the town of Nuremberg. Now that's as Nuremberg looked in 1390 in the Nuremberg Chronicle, which is the last great history of Europe, printed that's what it looked like in 1390, but the book itself was published in 1493, a year before Columbus arrived. So it's the last great history of Europe, of the world, that doesn't take note of the New World. Now at the bottom corner, that's the inset, that's Ullmann Stromer's paper mill. Now he starts that paper mill just about 50 or 60 years before Gutenberg comes up with this process to introduce the metal type, the making of fantasies and printing on paper. Now, would he have done that if he didn't have paper? You never, when you hear of the history of paper, printing, never do they really tie it in with the history of paper, as well they should, because really he also did Bibles on vellum, which is made from calfskin, or parchment, which is made from goat skin. They figure it took the skins of 250 sheep. If you were going to print the Gutenberg Bible on vellum or parchment, you needed the skins of 250 sheep to do one Bible. So obviously you couldn't afford to do that. You had to have paper. And it transformed the world. And so I use these various images. These are called stamping machines on the right. These are stampers, and that's where you put your rags. Now rags were really now in Japan and China, they used the trees. They didn't use rags, but the Arabs introduced rags. It came to Europe as rags. Pardon me. And then you really just see, I'm going to go pretty quickly through some of these. But these are very famous books where you illustrate various facets of paper making. And that's a very interesting book. That's Jacob Christian Schaefer. And that book is actually more scarce than the Gutenberg Bible. It's not worth as much, but there are only, I think, 7 or 8 complete, maybe 10 complete sets in 7 volumes in libraries. That's one of them which I handle. I handle 2 of them. That's the one at the Houghton Library at Harvard, and there's another one. But what this Schaefer did, he was a German naturalist and scientist, and it was a long German title, but it was Experiments in the Making of Paper Without Rags. They were desperate to find a new source of fiber, and he made paper, and he actually made tipped-in examples of paper from various plants that he grew in his own garden, and he made his own paper. And those books are very, very scarce, especially to have one with all 7 volumes. But it's kind of important to see that there. You hear the stories of the rag pickers. This is Harper's Weekly. When it gets to the U.S., we're still using rags. These are the rag merchants. So now we're kind of getting into the cultural aspects. I've done pretty much the migration of paper. Now we're in the U.S. And actually, for this book, not only did I go to China and Japan, but I wanted to go to the various paper mills where paper is made in the United States, where I could find an integrated mill, which I'll show you presently later. I wanted to see where paper is made from wood, this is the Markel plant down in New Jersey. Everything is recycled. When you see those blue recycle bins in New York, all that stuff is going over to Markel, where they make 1 million rolls of toilet paper a day. And you see curbside waste, magazines, it's all different kinds of paper that they use to make it. And that's kind of where it comes in. This is the wood yard at Glatfelter. Glatfelter Company is probably a company you've never really heard of. They're a $2 or $3 billion a year company, which is big, but not nearly as big as $25 billion a year International Paper. But I wanted to go to an integrated plant where literally the trees came in one end, as you see there. Those are wood chips out in the wood yard. And finished paper came out the other side. They redefined themselves in the late 90s when they saw that newspapers were starting to decline, book publishing was starting to decline. Big paper companies were going to start condensing, amalgamating. So what they did is they decided to become a niche paper maker. And by their estimate, they make paper for 1,000 different commercial products. They make most of the paper for stamps. They make most of the paper for Hallmark greeting cards. They make paper for Heineken beer. They make paper for candy wrappers. They make Swisher, whatever those dust things are made of paper. They make paper for every imaginable thing. I mean, you go and buy a hot dog, and it's that little thing that it's in, that's made with Glatfelter paper. Really, and that particular machine, now the Fourdrinier machine, that's when paper became mechanized in the early 19th century. That particular machine at the Glatfelter plant, which is 5 generations, that particular machine has been there since 1880, updated, and when we were there that day, my wife and I, they were making paper for postage stamps. And there it is. All this paper zooming through there. Those pastel papers were going to the Hallmark card plant. Now, what you're looking at down on the lower right, if you look closely, now there's a former high school schoolmate of mine right here who worked at the Crane Paper Company, and we just renewed our acquaintances after 55 years or something like that. Jeez. So I was underneath, that was at the Crane plant, and you're looking at little fleeting images of Benjamin Franklin. You're looking at the paper for $100 bills, which are speeding along there at about 60 miles an hour. And Crane is a 7-generation family-owned. It's made by the way, Crane paper is 100% rag. It's made from 75% cotton and 25% flax. It's rag paper. American currency is rag paper. And they've been making this exclusively for the United States government for 1879. And they just wanted to profile one company there. There's a handmade company. I'm going to go pretty quickly because I still got a lot of slides to go, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. But there's a company out in Indiana. I went out there, spent the day with them. They revived handmade paper. It's called Twin Rocker, and they do that there. Now, there's Bill Scheide. For those of you who know my first book, A Gentle Madness, I had a whole chapter on him. He was arguably the greatest living book collector in the world, and he was amazing. He was one of 3 people who owned all 7 known Gutenberg imprints. That one there, which is the 1450, the first Bible. He owned the 36-line Bible, the 2 Mind Psalters, 1457, 1459, another book called the Catholicon. Only 2 other people could make that claim, King George III and Lord Spencer of England, and Bill Scheide of the United States. And he died in 2014. And that's kind of what got me started, so I thought I'd put a little tribute. Again, I mentioned the Jikji. That's even older than the other one. I had to slip this in. I went to Korea. They told me, you've got to get our book in there. That's at the Bibliothèque Nationale, so I put it in. There it is. The first folio, everything we know about Shakespeare, virtually nothing comes to us in his handwriting. All we have are 7 signatures. If we don't have the printed book, the printed Shakespeare, those are 2 copies that I handled at the Folger Shakespeare Library. We don't have Shakespeare, so I have to remember my roots. Now, we always say the Bay Psalm book is the first book printed in North America, right? We'll show you that in a bit. But guess what? The Spaniards were making paper and printing in North America 100 years before they were doing it up here. When I went down to Mexico for the Spanish language edition of my book, and I gave a talk at the National Library of Mexico, and I had the picture of this book in the middle, 1565, which dates it. And when I finished, they took me in another room, and there it was. They had it. They brought it out for me to see. So you talk about these moments that say, whoa, and it's one of a kind, you know. And look how beautiful it is. I mean, it's 2 colors, printing, nice paper. And these are Mexican imprints. And you know, the finest collection in the, really in the world, I think even including Mexico, is to be found of these Spanish imprints. How far are we from Providence, Rhode Island here? About 30 miles. Yeah. The John Carter Brown Library has the finest collection to be found anywhere. Here are 3 more of them. And there's your Basbanes book, which dates to 1640. That was the one from the Boston Public Library that they sold for $10 million. I handled that, and it's in terrible shape, you know, but there you go. Now we talk about ephemera. What's ephemera? These are things that are printed that are not expected to last the long haul. You know, they have a very temporary use. But sometimes when examples of ephemera survive, like the Honus Wagner baseball card that you see up there, which sold for $2.8 million in 2007, or the Action Comics #1, first appearance of Superman, sold for what, 10 cents on the newsstand in 1938, sold for $2.1 million in 20. That's the Nicolas Cage copy, which was reported stolen, and he got a $150,000. Sure, then they discovered it, came back, and then they sold it at auction for $2 million. Amazing, isn't it? But how about that British Guiana stamp right down there? That's sold at auction for $10 million. I think it's the most money ever spent for the least amount of weight. I mean, you can't even measure the weight. It's so tiny, and it's ugly, but there you go. And of course, that's a $10,000 silver certificate. But ephemera is very interesting. There's a wonderful collection of ephemera at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware, and this couple, they collected 250,000 pieces of chromolithographed ephemera, including the earliest Valentines, the first Christmas cards, and I discuss it at some length in the book, but I'll have to go a little quickly. How about Bob Dylan's song that sold for $2 million of Like a Rolling Stone? That's the Amazon Hotel Stationery. So you're talking about paper. What's a piece of paper work? I say paper is the only artifact that's basically valueless in and of itself. And this card has no value. What's the worth of it? But all of a sudden, if Pablo Picasso did a little, I'm sorry, thanks a lot, a little sketch on there, it might be worth something. Or if Bob Dylan, thank you, if Bob Dylan takes a sheet of paper and writes out Like a Rolling Stone on it, then maybe it's amazing. You can't say that about anything else that I can think of. Not just writing, but how about the head of a muse? Raphael, $48 million, and that was a preparatory sketch for a painting in the Vatican. Again, it's a piece of paper. Now, this is priceless, right? When I went to the Massachusetts Historical Society, I asked Peter Drummey. They have 10 million paper artifacts. They're manuscripts now, not books, manuscripts, unique. And he said this is his favorite. And what this was a letter from William Bradford to John Winthrop in 1638. I think you can see the date down there. They were basically the governor of one province writing to the governor of another. It's a letter of some substance. And they were talking about a border dispute and religious things and all kinds of stuff. Of course, there's no paper being made in North America yet, so paper is very scarce. And what makes this particular document really cool is that Winthrop's answer to Bradford is written on the same piece of paper. So that's Bradford over there and Winthrop answering over there. It's pretty. It tells you so much, not only about what was going on, but just how precious paper is. And here's our birth certificate. I mean, we date our history, don't we, with the printing of this particular document. Not the one written out in hand. That took on parchment. That took time to get that around. But on the evening of July the 4th, 1776, John Dunlap's printing shop down in Philadelphia, these were being done and went out around the land. Now, this is down in Natick, Ken Rendell, the World War II Museum. Are you familiar with it? But if you have a chance to go down there, it's fantastic. And Ken's really started off as a manuscript dealer, book dealer. He was built Bill Gates' library. He built this magnificent museum of World War II objects. And in that safe there, he went and he took out this document and he handed it to me. And he says, what you are holding in your hands is the document that starts World War II. That's the Munich Agreement. Those are the changes written in by hand by Adolf Hitler and Neville Chamberlain. And how he got it is another story. So you talk about how a piece of paper really has the power to do something. There's an example. And I'll go pretty quickly, but I have a chapter on thinking on paper, really using paper as an instrument of the creative process. So here's Leonardo da Vinci and here's Beethoven. I'm going pretty quickly now. Thomas Edison, 3,500 sketchbooks. And I've handled all of these things, by the way. Amazing. This is a very simple sketch of the light bulb, which I, by the way, used a carbonized piece of paper, later went to bamboo. And there's the first phonograph, which actually used paraffin, which is wax paper for the very first recording device, paper. And these are amazing, the stories of Jacques Carré and the Parthenon friezes. This French draftsman was sent to the Acropolis in 1674, 7 years before the Venetians bombarded it, and he was actually able to see the Parthenon as it kind of like it existed when the Greeks built it 2,500 years ago. And then Elgin came and took out the rest. But if you really want to see, I had to get these from the Bibliothèque Nationale. They were expensive too, but you had to have them. And there they are, they're magnificent. And then, of course, we talk about the history of St. Paul's Cathedral, which was destroyed in the Great Fire of London. If it's not for William Dugdale, who goes and writes the history because the churches are falling apart, and he goes and he brings Wenceslas Haller, the great artist, we wouldn't have these images of this is a great wonder that only exists on paper. So we talk about that. And then Sir Christopher Wren comes forward and he builds the new St. Paul's Cathedral. Now architecture is really developing because there's an abundance of paper in Europe. There's a paper spreading all over the continent, and that's the triumph of Sir Christopher Wren on a print. And these are the devices that really became so standardized to use to draw architectural drawings. And the cousin of architecture is engineering. Would the 19th century be possible without drawing to precise scale and to reproducing plans that are precise to everywhere they go? You can't have any variation. When people are building a locomotive and wheels here and here, then everything comes together. Everything has to be correct. You need blueprints. You need something. Blueprints, technical drawings, and the Industrial Revolution. And I'm from Lowell, and that's an industrial city that was totally planned, and that's on Whatman paper. That's a very famous English paper. And those drawings, which now go back over just about 200 years, up at the Lowell Historical National Park. And we all know the story of Lowell, and to a lesser degree, when you come down in this part, we also had these Industrial Revolution sites that were constructed. It's again all on paper. Then I have a nice origami. That's a couple of master origami makers. So there's some fun. You see that penguin? That's one piece of paper. And he's from Haverhill. His name is Michael LaFosse, world-renowned origami master. And he said the first time he did the penguin, because the paper was black on one side, white on the other, he had it wrong. He had the chest black and the rest of the body white. He had to take the whole thing apart and redo it again. And that fellow up there is a very famous astrophysicist, and he became an origami master. That's at MIT, Eric Demain, where they actually use origami. And just for fun, illumination night at Martha's Vineyard with the paper lanterns. And I thought, gee, they look like balloons, don't they? Well, the very first flying machine was a balloon made of paper, with paper from a paper mill. The Montgolfier brothers from the Montgolfier mill, they used 5 layers of the paper. And paper. And the Japanese balloons, you ever hear of the Japanese attack balloons in World War II? 10,000 of them made from handmade paper, launched from Japan towards the end of the war. You didn't hear about it because it was all censored. And thankfully, they just blew across with the jet stream, and they landed randomly in the West. But there is a marker in Oregon where 4 people, a woman and 3 children, were killed by one. And so the only instance during World War II where civilians were killed in the mainland by hostile fire was by a paper balloon. I write about that at some length, but that's one that was actually photographed. And then, of course, what does the word photograph mean? It means writing with light. Writing with light. And all of our earliest photographs are iconic images on paper, right? And the very first computers used what? Punched paper ballots. And the very first computers. You remember that? You know, the thing of it is, one of the things we learned is that you really, one way you ensure an honest election is by having a paper ballot. You know, you might be able to do it electronically, but if there's no paper record, what good is it? Remember all this for 5 weeks, counting the chads on paper? And then I went to various places where they do archival conservation, Library of Congress, Weitzman in Cambridge. I'm going pretty quickly because of time. That's the Library of Congress. Red tape, you know where red tape gets its name. That's actual real red tape at the National Archives, not the Library of Congress. So they were actually taking these old, John Tyler, these old documents. That's the actual original plans for the Monopoly game up there. That was the patent filed for it. And they were taking these red tapes off. And I said, what are you doing with them? They said, well, we're throwing, I said, let me have a couple. I'm a collector. So I got some actual real original red tape. But there you go. And now we talk about something we really don't have anymore is ticker tape parades, because we don't really have ticker tape anymore. But that was for John Glenn in 1962. Now when they have ticker tape parades, it's fake ticker tape. They buy confetti in Connecticut and they bring it in. But the ticker tape in its day was the very first printable computer, wasn't it? Just changed the way business was conducted all over the world. And now it's all computer. And they really, up until the 1960s, every transaction was documented on paper. I have a couple of major chapters on bureaucracy and how bureaucracy is made possible by paper. And now we come to the final sequence. You remember, I mean, actually I would say every one of my books starts with something, starts with an image. And this one, I remember as we all watched television that day and we saw the attack on the Twin Towers and all this paper spewing into the sky, right? Plumes of paper. And the only artifacts of any consequence, really, it's a matter of extraordinary irony, to survive that day was paper. And I said, gee, has anyone done any kind of archival work on this, trying to determine? Obviously, most of it went out to the landfill. They had to clean up the site. But in that final chapter, which I call Elegy in Fragments, you know, you'll see, and I offer you some pretty interesting stories of what was going on. But really, you look at some of these pictures, and it's paper everywhere, isn't it? Just don't need much comment. And that's out in the landfill, and that's a book being looked at. Now I'll finish with 2 images. This is a card. You can say it's Pablo Ortiz, construction inspector. You can do a Google of him, do Pablo Ortiz, and then say also 9/11 or Twin Towers. And he's one of the unknown heroes. I mean, obviously the first responders and everyone else. But he worked for the Port Authority. He survived with another man. They could have gotten out. They actually helped, I think if you listen to the original 911 calls and people who survived, it was Pablo Ortiz and another guy who probably saved 150 lives using tools, helping get people out, helping them escape. They kept going up, and they perished when the South Tower collapsed. That night, this card landed on a windowsill, went across the East River into Brooklyn, and landed on a windowsill in Brooklyn. And you can see the singes around the corner. And you talk about leaving, it gives me tears, you know, leaving your calling card. And then it was only later when they brought it in, when I went down there when they were still building the 9/11 museum, she had the card, the woman who was the curator, and she told me the story. And it was pretty amazing. And here's the last one. Now this story is totally true. It's not apocryphal. It's totally documented. On the day of the attack, on September 11th, there was a woman who was escaping, and as she's fleeing the scene, a piece of paper comes down from one of the towers. I think it's the South Tower. This is the piece of paper. She picks it up. She reads it. She runs down the street, and she turns it over to a guard for one of the banks there. It's actually one of the federal banks. And he looks at it, and at that moment, the building collapses. And that's all it says. 84th floor, West office, 12 people trapped. No name. It's just I was going to call this book, by the way, Common Bond, which I like, but my editor wanted something. She said it's cute, but we live in an age where you can't be cute. We got to call it on paper. But I have a chapter called Common. That's a piece of Common Bond paper. And everyone was, and on that particular tower, the 84th floor, 83rd, 82nd, everyone was assumed to have died instantly there because that's where that United jet flew in. But apparently at least a dozen people survived. They kind of came in at an angle, and they were desperately trying to survive, and they didn't make it. And one of them wrote that note, tossed it out the window, somebody picked it up. And even if it were just anonymous, we'd say, well, that note speaks for all the victims that day. But when I saw it, and I was there, and I said to the woman, I said, what is that smudge? She said, well, that's blood. That's blood. I said, well, can't you? She said, we hope to. She said, but there's still 30,000, or whatever, however many thousand fragments that they were going through all of them. So that was back in 2009. I mean, I worked on this for a long time, 2010. So then I'm getting the book ready 3 years ago right now. The book came out 2013. I called, made my calls. I said, by the way, anything ever come of that? And she was silent. And she said, we got a hit, and we know who it is. And they had just told the woman that her husband was the person. They made a total 100% DNA match. But the woman understandably didn't want to talk. And I said, that's fine, I understand it. And then 2 days later, they got back and they said, well, Denise Johnson will talk to you in Stamford, Connecticut. And I went down, and that was easily one of the toughest interviews I've ever had. She had 3 young daughters who were little and had grown up. And she said, and you know, that word closure doesn't do anything for me. We had all thought that Randy had died instantly, and now we know he fought for his life. And she said, one of the girls said, Mommy, did he suffer? She said, you know your father, he was fighting, he was trying to help his people. So that's one of the few artifacts now at the new 9/11 museum that's there. It's one of the very few that is not owned by the museum. She is letting them have that in perpetuity, but she said, it's just a piece of common bond paper, she said, but that's the legacy that my daughters have of their father. And so that's kind of where I ended the book, and I did it in under an hour, so I'm pretty happy. Thank you very much for coming out. Any questions?